What would you do if you were an athlete and were forced to prove your gender? It happened to cyclist Kristen Worley, and that prompted her to take the International Olympic Committee and Cycling Canada to the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal, where she won. Her book, Woman Enough: How a Boy Became a Woman and Changed the World of Sport, tells that story. It was co-authored with Johanna Schneller, and it brings Kristen Worley back to her studio. Hi, Kristen.
It's a pleasure to meet you, Nam.
Yeah, it's
I'm
nice
glad
to
to be
see
here
you.
at TVO.
It's nice to see you. In this time, we're living in a time when people are asking how we each identify, and it's becoming very commonplace. You write that you prefer to say that you are an XY woman. Why is the LGBTQ label wrong for you?
The issue, something that I've been involved in this for over 20 years. And something that I've learned, and it's common for me and important to me, was to embrace all diversity. I look at from cultural to social to sexuality, gender, to now we've gone from disability to ability-based in terms of the sporting arena, to sport through technology to more ability-based type of thinking. So for me, I always kind of look at my journey through the gender sphere, is that through that vision, that is unique to my experience. And for me, it was really important to create a place of engagement socially for people, one, to learn about my diversity and share that story, but at the same time, hearing other people's stories on their diversity, because a lot of the times we get caught up in these kind of boxes and how we try to define people, even by hair color or the color of our eyes. And you go in box A or you go in box B, and that is used very commonly in the sporting arena and how we identify individuals. And so it actually, in many cases, can be very harmful. So
In what ways?
well, and I'll come back to it in a very simple way. And this is what we did when I was in my court case here in Toronto with the International Olympic Committee, the World Anti-Doping Agency, World Cycling, which is the Union Cycling International in Canadian cycling, is it originally had translated into the verbiage around transgendered and transitioned athletes, in that kind of that identity box. But it was clear over the times, during the time of my participation in sport, that the policies that were being put in place by the IOC, there was no science or research to the policies.
We're going to talk more about the case, but
Yeah.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the book.
Yep.
You write that it's hard for you to talk about the boy and young men you were prior to transitioning, Chris Jackson.
Mm-hmm.
Is it becoming easier in the wake of writing Woman Enough?
Great question. Yeah, I've actually been putting a lot of thought to this, because in the last 20 years, I've kind of shoved that away, to being able for me to become Kristen. And for me, in my mind, I was pushing that away, one, because of the hurt, because there's a lot of history of hurt as a young person, as a child coming in through my adulthood, that is aligned to that person. And it was important for me to redefine myself as Kristen and kind of rewire myself and kind of come through that transition. A lot of people tend to, because of our social media and various medias that we have that are talk about these issues, think that somehow you can be Bob one day and Bobby the next. For someone like me, it was important to have to relearn things, realign myself to the social ideals of what it meant to be Kristen and what it meant to me personally. And I can honestly tell you, through the court case, that whole process, that whole identity process, because it forced me to have to relive all the struggles through my sporting career, but also having to realign myself to the struggles I had as a child, which actually created that structure for me to come through one end throughout to the other as a stronger person. So it's interesting, because I was just thinking about this the other day, and a year ago, I was presenting in Geneva at the heads of global sport, had the heads of the IOC and world football with FIFA and so on, and the Commonwealth and so on, and United Nations. I was standing up on a podium as the wounded athlete, per se. A year later, just this past Christmas, before Christmas, I was standing in front of the same group in Paris at UNESCO, standing up as Kristen. Standing up as Kristen as the designer, no longer as the athlete.
Did you feel stronger? Did you feel different? Or
I felt I felt empowered. I felt like I was on the other side of the fence. And collegially, it was interesting. The heads of international sport had said to me, they go, "You're in a really great place, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm on the other side now."
And something that, as Chris Jackson, that helped Chris Jackson to get into a better headspace was sport. What role did sport play in Chris Jackson's life?
Well, as a young person, it's very common to a lot of young people who are dealing with diversity issues, and unfortunately common in our society. There's the issues that you hear commonly about bullying, and particularly, time has flown by in my lifetime. I'm middle-aged now, so it's a kind of a funny thing to think about. I've got a bit of a patina on me. Back in the time when I was growing up, we didn't have the languages around in the support networks when we talked about diversity or talked about sexuality, gender. And so there wasn't a lot of family discussion about it, and there also wasn't a lot of professional discussion about it, even in schooling. So for me, I was bullied a lot, and I was very much of a creative kid, and I didn't know why I was being bullied. I didn't know how I was projecting to my peer group, from grades 4, 5, 6, and 7. And where sports started to come into my life was in around middle school, where I learned how to run, and I learned that I could run fast. And sport actually became more of a protector for me at that point in time in my life, where I actually could create a layer between me and my friends, which my friends could identify as me being somebody of value that they could have a friendship with.
Because you were athletic.
Because I so much of it was, I don't, for me, I never saw it as being athletic. To me, it was a layer of protection that enabled me to kind of protect myself from people kind of finding out about myself and my diversity until I tried to figure it out and understood it. But also, it created a layer where I could interact with people. So sport actually became, particularly endurance sport, became a tool for me to kind of tire myself out and kind of isolate myself as a way of managing the struggles I was having individually and privately.
And as Chris was a very successful competitive water skier and took part in the World Championships. Why did he make the move to cycling?
It was interesting. I went into water skiing because my family was very much, my father was a very driven man, respectfully, a strong businessman. He was a world champion in sailing. We were a big sailing family and snow skiing family. And I think with the combination of my diversity combined with my sport initiatives, water skiing became an angle which enabled me to be away from my family and go kind of sideways. Because for me, I was able to go down to Central Florida for a period of time during the year and train down in Central Florida, and allowed me to experiment a little bit more with Kristen, rather than having to live more in a more conservative environment and deal with the stress of living within my family model, because I couldn't express that aspect of my being.
But water skiing wasn't an Olympic sport.
Right. So after I had gone through my experience in water skiing, I did compete at the World Championships, and for me, the experience with water skiing was wonderful. I met some wonderful people around the world, which I still have friendships today. But for me, water skiing is an Olympic-affiliated sport. And interestingly enough, Canada is probably one of the best water skiing countries in the world. And so a lot of people don't know an Albertan by the name of Jarrett Llewellyn. He's probably the most winningest athlete. He actually was on the Canadian Olympic Committee, the Athletes Commission at one point. He's probably the most winningest athlete in Canadian history. Even outside of Wayne Gretzky. But people just don't know that, and they don't never think of us as a water skiing nation. But we are one of the best programs in the world in terms of water skiing, coming out of the Great White North. So anyway, sport became, particularly water skiing, became that activity for me where I could leave my family for a period of a few months, be able to train away from my family, typically in another country,
And excelled, like you really excelled.
I did excel at it, absolutely.
Yeah.
But it became a tool. It wasn't so much of a tool as people like think of. You wanted to be a champion in the sport. For me, it was more of a tool to escape.
But in the process, you were very good at it.
Exactly.
And then you started to cycle. And just to fast forward, because we have so much to get into, you have such a fascinating story. In 1988 in St. Catharines, you were in a road cycling race and something happened that was monumental to you. What happened in that race?
I was poised in the upper. It was higher up in my. This is before my transition, and it was a moment in time where I was moving very high up in the ranks in the Canadian cycling system. This is a moment as I moved out of water skiing into cycling, and I was able to. Because my focus was I wanted to get to the Olympic Games. I wanted to compete where water skiing couldn't take me. So what I was able to do, I moved very quickly up through the ranks of the sport because I'd already had that base training, that base coaching at an international level that was kind of founded from my experience in water skiing, which I was able to translate into my cycling career very quickly. And what had happened as I was in a terrible road accident where at the very front of the peloton, where it commonly doesn't happen, a rider went down right at the very front of the pack. He crossed the pack and took over 20 riders down. And I was sitting along the outside, and two of my teammates were on my back wheel as we were coming in through the sprint. So they were probably going about 55, 60 kilometers an hour or quicker. And it just created a domino effect, which a lot of people have probably seen that happen in bike racing before.
This made international news.
And I broke my pelvis in the process. Yeah.
You eventually transitioned to Kristen, and then you start cycling again. How open were the Canadian and international cycling bodies to having you compete as a female athlete initially?
Well, for me, after I had my accident, I delayed myself going back to school. I delayed my schooling because in the goals to go to compete at the international levels in cycling for Canada and hopefully the Olympic Games. So for me, it was almost like a moment that I look at it now, Nam, that it was almost like somebody was saying to me, you have to stop, really stop at this moment. And rethink yourself, retool yourself. And that was the moment that I started, when I was going through the schooling process and my relationship with my partner, Allison, that I started to really rethink and where I began my transition. And so it was like that moment in time that somebody, if you believe in some kind of spiritual moment or calling.
It was now or never, right?
It was now or never that was going to happen. And so that's when all that started to evolve. And then it wasn't until the year 2000, 2001, when a young Canadian by the name of Michelle Dumaras from British Columbia, who was a downhill mountain biker, came into the downhill mountain biking scene in Canada and started winning. And what had happened is that it was learned that she had a background and that she'd been a transition athlete. So there was no policy or understanding of this in any sports or activity at that moment in time, anywhere in the world. And a good friend of mine by the name of, who came to me by the name of Dr. Ross Utterbridge. He was at one point was head of the medical commission for the International Water Ski Federation and for Water Ski Canada. And Ross had learned of my background. He's an orthopedic surgeon out in Kamloops. And he called me privately saying, if you learned about this athlete, do you think you can help us? And I said, sure. And I said, as long as you keep it private, because I didn't want anybody to know of my transition. And so I started getting multiple calls from Ottawa behind the scenes, because at that point they had removed Michelle's license, her international license, from competing because they thought, what do we do with this athlete? So I'd spent years working with experts, international experts, about my own transition and understanding about diversity at a very physiological level. So I was able to provide a lot of that information to which Michelle came back, was enabled to educate the system to which she came back into the sport and continued competing. So it wasn't that moment in time until I thought that I would come back to the sport, because I never thought I'd come back to sport. That wasn't my interest. I thought my years in competing was over until that moment.
Well, eventually after you set your sights once again on riding at the Olympics, you're put through a process of gender verification, which you write about this way in the book. In 2003, the International Olympic Committee, IOC, together with the World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, have put out a 2-page policy statement, the Stockholm Consensus on Sex Reassignment in Sport, to govern the process by which transitioned athletes are authenticated, verified as the gender they say they are, and permitted to compete. It was now April 2005. I was the first athlete to be tested under this new policy anywhere in the world. Of the 4 men in the room, 2 were sport administrators, 1 was a lawyer, and the 4th was an emergency room doctor, not a gender or endocrine specialist. The assumed authority of sport had empowered them to do whatever they wanted to me. It was like handing a layman a scalpel and saying, "Here, now you're a heart surgeon. Don't worry about the law. We answer to no one." That sounds extremely invasive. What was that process like for you to go through?
There's a multiple of things here. First of all, this policy was designed in conjunction with Michelle's participation in sport. So the IOC, the history of this is that the IOC at that time felt they had to lead this in sport through the mechanisms of the Olympic movement to help sport understand what to do with these athletes. There's nothing to do with these athletes, but we can talk about that in a little bit. But the issue is that there was these assumptions made, and that the IOC had taken it upon themselves to generate a policy, which we knew at a later date there was no science or research to the policies whatsoever. So understanding that you've got these policies that are coming out of Switzerland by a private entity to 206 nations around the world that are then imposing these standards against the civil liberties and rights of a specific country, using Canada as an example, and where if we did this in a legal, in a legal or medical environment, you would never see it. We have law societies, we have the medical society, Ontario surgeons and generals to do oversight of practitioners in these spaces.
But in sports, it was happening.
In sport, there seems to be no oversight or no mechanisms to ensure the safeties of the athletes, and this is very common practice, and this is what sadly, which I use often, and what happens is that these policies are put in place where people of non-authority, I hate using that, non-expertise, or reason to understand why they're even doing it in the first place, because there is no science and research of the policies, so they don't even definitively know why they're doing it. So the issue is that they've imposed and empowered themselves to think that they can do it, one, that they feel that they have a right to do it, and then thirdly, thinking that the athlete deserves it. So you'll see in a lot of the writing, which I talk about a lot in my book, from the IOC, from the World Anti-Doping Agency, from the World Cycling Union, Cycling International, and from Ottawa, every time from Sport Canada, even right down to Cycling Canada, which we were able to show in the court processes, all the language was it's either, Kristen, it's either your way or our way or the highway.
And then if you're an athlete, you want to do your sport,
right.
So you don't really feel like you have a choice.
You don't have a choice. That's the point. Because of where the policy was coming from, and kind of by social design, they felt that they were doing something right.
Well, the thing that you say that they thought they were doing right was this perceived advantage. You write that the men on this panel assumed that someone born in a male body would be able to outperform an XX female athlete. Right. But you say that's wrong. Why is this assumption wrong?
Well, there's a whole science piece to this, and I think if I could come back to the interactions with these in terms of the process. I mean, they got as far as asking me, well, will you have any other surgeries into your body? And I was looking at them going, pardon me? How is that to deal with my identity as an individual, as an athlete, let alone you acknowledging any expertise in science, if in terms of anything that I would surgically intervention. I said, yeah, I'm going to get I actually responded to them because I was so distressed. I said to them, actually, I'm going to actually get some changes to my earlobes, to make me a little bit more aerodynamic,
And you do point out in the book that there are other athletes using that argument of perceived advantage, example, in basketball, if somebody's a 7-footer, would
Right.
that be perceived advantage because they're taller than everybody else?
Right, and so I mean, right. So the idea of perceived advantage in sport, we can't talk about these advantages and perceived advantages in sport because we don't understand the basics of the human physiology. We don't secondarily understand the basis of the sciences of athletes' health and wellness, individual health and wellness. It can't be seen as an umbrella because science doesn't support that. It has to be done on an individual level. And thirdly, we are embracing social constructs of the ideas of men over women.
Well, let's talk about what you did next, because
absolutely.
in 2015, you took your complaints with the governing bodies for cycling and the Olympics to the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. Why there?
So over the 20-year period, I worked with, I came to know many athletes from around different nations around the world. And my health declined so enormously that I realized that the sporting system, you tend to, at elite sport, have between an 8 to 10-year window to where you can be an elite athlete. That's kind of the height and curve, and then you retire. So the sporting system kind of depends on that idea, where most athletes wouldn't have done what I've done, let alone had the stamina to do it over a 3-year period. Because to walk away from your sport, what happens is you will then lose opportunity to compete, train, compete, get on national teams or go on to world events.
So you had the difficult decision to choose between your health or the sport, right?
Right. I wasn't the system itself was continuing to oppress me and hope that which we were able to show in the courts. They were hoping that I would eventually get tired of doing this. So what I decided at that point in time, and I learned through the Achilles heel was for me was by not signing my athlete license, because no matter what sport you sign your license, like if it's athletics, cycling, water skiing or snow skiing or whatever, we all sign off our rights as athletes to the Olympic movement, which you then sign off your rights as an athlete to the Court of Arbitration in Switzerland, which is owned and run by the IOC, and then off to the anti-doping program with the World Anti-Doping Agency. So I learned that under the Canadian Charter, by signing that off, what happens is I then cannot take any civil litigation against or an action against sport.
But it can be a human rights.
No. Actually, no, because I had to prove why it wasn't an issue like I deserve to compete, which a lot of people assimilate that automatically, thinking that because I'm an athlete who went through transition. I had to prove the sciences because we knew the IOC, World Cycling, and everybody else engaged in this circle didn't have it. So we actually had to engage at a level to bring them up to an education level to understand why it was a human rights issue. By explaining that aspect of it, they then understood why they're here and how then it would become a human rights issue. It's not that it wasn't a human rights issue that the fact that I deserve to compete. No, it's the fact that the IOC never did the science and the research, but that was impacting my health and my ability to compete in a healthy way as a typical high-performance athlete in my given sport.
We only have a couple minutes, and I want to get one more question in. Eventually, your hearings before the Human Rights Tribunal led to a joint statement from you and the Ontario Cycling Association and Cycling Canada, which stated, on June 30th, 2015, Kristen Worley, an XY female athlete, commenced an application in the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, which brought attention to the challenges faced by XY female athletes participating in sport. Ms. Worley has been a leader in her efforts to raise awareness and education in human rights in Canadian and international sport. Aside from this validating statement, what concrete actions have been put in place as a result of your case?
Great question. It's gotten to a point where we need to empower the system and educate people. And now the group that we had involved, like we had 5 sets of lawyers that were involved with this whole process, and that they now know better. And so my goal was to empower the sport of cycling, because UCI also put out a response as well internationally. The World Cycling did as well in support of this, in which I met with David Laprente, who's the new CEO, president of World Cycling in Geneva last year, which they are committed to human rights and improving the policies of greater inclusion, not just in the sport of cycling, but within the Olympic movement itself. So that's where this is kind of has gone to, and kind of legitimizing the process. And I think the biggest part of this is which is really important, what we're seeing even 1 year from when I was in Geneva, from when I was in UNESCO, 1 year later, I've now principally been able to put the foundation of human rights front and center for all athletes worldwide in the global sporting system. That is the commonality in the infrastructure that's going on, that's being developed in the global system.
What work still needs to be done?
There's tremendous amount of work being done. And I can tell you now, through my efforts and through the Commonwealth efforts for the Commonwealth Games, the CGF I'm working with immensely, exclusively right now. Coming out of the Brisbane Commonwealth Games successfully this past year in Australia, they founded the first principal human rights piece and mission and direction of the global sports system. And what's happened is become part of the CGF's, the Commonwealth Games Federation's, business model to move into a leadership position, which we hope that World Cycling will also come into that position as well, to be able to move this and leverage this language to a better place of greater inclusion. And when we talk about inclusion, we talk about diversity, we talk about culture diversity, we talk about sexuality, gender, and individual ability, and moving everybody into a more inclusive and really focusing on our humanity rather than 12, 14 days in sport, where we want to create environments that are through these movements that are building and improving people's lives around the world.
Kristen, thank you so much for being here and for writing this book. Using your voice as a Canadian, I know is helping so many other athletes around the world who might not be able to do that. So thank you for writing it and for being here.
It's a great honor to be here, and thank you for the opportunity.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario, and by viewers like you. Thank you.